Good morning, everybody. I'm going to get started now, and if people are still joining us, hopefully they will not miss too much at the moment. I'm Carla Parsons, and I'm delighted to be joined today by colleagues from Mills and Reeve, Judith Houston, Ramsey Ozcan, Katrina Anderson, and Alex Woolgar. So today's session is a look back at 2024 and a look forward at 20G. It's a very appropriate time, I feel, to be doing this, not only because it's the end of the year, so traditional time to be thinking back to what we've seen and what's going ahead, but especially in ESG as we come towards the end of COP29, the Conference of the Parties in Azerbaijan, and we're waiting to see if the parties can strike a deal, and also as we wait to see what changes might occur in America following the current election. So a couple of housekeeping points. We will be recording this presentation and it will be available towards the end of the week. So you can ask us a question. We've got a Q&A box, so please do ask any questions you would like and we will answer them at the end of the session. We've also got a poll running, which is asking you to tell us what you would like to see in future in-house and focus sessions in relation to ESG. We've got a range of topics, including CSRD, CSDDD, CSDDD, governance, supply chain, sustainable supply chain management, ESG reporting, greenwashing, sustainable green finance, human rights and labour practice, extended producer responsibility, and anything else. But if there's something else you'd like to hear us talk about in a future session, please include that in the feedback and we will have a look at it. It really helps us to understand what ESG topics are most appropriate to you. ESG is such a huge ranging area, as you know, so we'd like to make sure that when we do these sessions, they are of the most value to you possible. So, quick look at what we're going to be doing today. Jude's going to be talking to you about reporting and governance. Ramsey's then going to talk a little bit about employment law and how the S has become more and more part of ESG considerations for employers in the last year. We're then going to turn to Alex, who's going to look at litigation. And finally, Katrina is going to look at greenwashing. Now, as I said before, ESG is such a huge ranging area. And it's really impossible, as I'm sure you know, to touch on every single area or to touch on it in depth. So what the four panelists are going to do for you today is they've taken some of the issues that they think are going to be of most interest to your organizations and those that are most pressing, and has come up with themes in the past year more and more to the front for organizations in respect of ESG. They're going to look at those a little bit, looking back at 2024, the changes we've seen, and look at going forward to 2025. Mainly focusing on the UK, but there will be some mentions of other jurisdictions as well. But again, if there's anything you hear that you think, gosh, I'd really like to hear a bit more on that, please provide it to us in the feedback at the end of the session. Because, as I say, we want to make sure these sessions are of most value to you. So I'm now going to hand over to Judith Houston, who's going to talk to you about reporting and governance.
Thanks very much, Carla, and I'm really pleased to see that ESG reporting was doing pretty well on that poll. So perhaps you will hear more from us on that topic in future. For today, I'm just going to spend the next 5 minutes reflecting on ESG reporting trends from 2024 and considering what's likely to be on the horizon in 2025. So in 2024, first up, what did we see? No need for an introduction, greenwashing. It remained a critical issue this year with regulatory bodies such as the Financial Conduct Authority and the Competition and Markets Authority starting to crack down on misleading claims. And we saw several high-profile cases highlighting the need for accurate, transparent, and verifiable ESG reporting. I'm not going to say any more on this because Katrina, my colleague, is going to talk a little more about greenwashing later on in the session. Another area that we saw developments in was interoperability of ESG standards. So what do I mean by that? I mean the ability of different reporting frameworks to work together seamlessly. For example, we saw the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation and European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG, publish guidance to harmonise the international sustainability standards and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, helping to reduce complexity and improve comparability for companies that have to report under both frameworks. We also saw EFRAG and the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures publish a correspondence mapping that highlights the commonality between the two frameworks. And speaking of nature-related risks and biodiversity, we saw quite a lot of integrating of biodiversity and nature-related risks into ESG reporting, gained a lot of momentum. Primarily, I think that was driven by frameworks like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and the UK also published its biodiversity framework earlier this year, which I think also helped shine a spotlight on this topic. Fourth, we have enhanced climate risk reporting. So the concept of climate transition plans gained a lot of momentum in 2024, and the publication of Transition Plan Task Force final report came out, which again, I think helped drive momentum in this area. Finally, in 2024, we also saw a surge in ESG disclosure regulations globally, CSRD, CS3D, California rules out there in terms of corporate data accountability, and the SEC. Won't go into detail today, but in fact, sometimes it was hard to keep up, and things move so quickly. So next year, if I had a crystal ball, what would my predictions be? Well, the regulatory and political pressure isn't going to stop. It's clear from the Chancellor's recent budget, commitments made at COP29, clean energy and sustainable finance are very much on the political agenda. That's going to mean more mandatory targets for reducing things like CO2 emissions, and that means more reporting and also more complex reporting. We're also expecting to see the UK adopt the International Sustainability Standards Board's S1 and S2 standards to create the UK Sustainability Reporting Standards. And we may see regulation introduced next year that will regulate ESG rating providers. There's a draft statutory instrument currently out for technical comment at the moment. And if that is introduced, we will see a tightening of reporting requirements placed on the companies that are the subject of those ratings. I'm going to take 2 and 3 together. I also think in 2025, we're going to see a greater focus on cross-border compliance and ESG in supply chain management. This is obviously driven by regulations like CSRD, and we're going to see the first reports being issued under CSRD in 2025. As you know, it necessitates very comprehensive reporting and sustainable practices throughout cross-border value chains. So companies, I think, are going to need to start to gather data and ensure compliance with standards across boards in their value chain. I think we've lost the slides, but that's okay. I only had 2 points left. The fourth was the increase in use of advanced technologies. For example, AI and blockchain. These tools have already started to enhance data accuracy and streamline reporting processes, but I think their role in 2025 in the context of ESG reporting is likely to expand as companies seek to ensure compliance with rapidly evolving standards and also reduce the risk of greenwashing allegations at the same time. And finally, while environmental concerns have taken centre stage in 2024, I think social value is an area that's likely to gain momentum in 2025. I think there's probably going to be quite a large focus on societal impact of business activities, including employees' well-being, human rights due diligence. And we can hopefully look forward to some guidance on that from the Task Force on Inequality and Social-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a recent UK initiative. And on the topic of social value and employees' well-being, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Ramsey Ozkan in employment, who's going to talk to you about some of the more social side of things.
Thank you very much, Jude, and really pleased to be here this morning and seeing so many of you joining us. So as Jude mentioned, I'm going to be covering the S components in ESG, the social and value side of things, and how this has shaped the landscape, both in 2024 and how this looks in terms of upcoming reforms in employment law in 2025 and beyond. I think the overarching theme has been that ESG factors have very much significantly influenced recent developments in employment law. I think to start off with, it's very much worth mentioning that we've seen a change in expectations on employers over the years, very much so since the pandemic. So it's not just 2024, of course, but I think this growing trend has continued. And this includes a shift in expectation from investors, the workforce itself, customers, and regulators for those in regulated industries. I think it's safe to say that employees are very much looking for purposeful employers who are committed to delivering meaningful change, with ESG very much at the top of their agenda. And these are some of the trends that we've been seeing. So I'll take you on a very quick whistle-stop tour of some of the recent trends, what this has meant for 2024, and then the year ahead. A strong commitment to diversity, equality and inclusion and well-being, I think is top of the agenda when it comes to ESG expectations and commitments that employees are looking for from their employers. So what does an ESG friendly workplace look like? As set out on the slide there, employees are expecting organisations and employers to be very much committed to D&I well-being, both in terms of mental and physical health. A commitment to flexible working is very much there. Whistleblowing processes, and on that front, I mean having the processes in place, being committed to those, being transparent, and very much not just tackling issues such as that as a box ticking. Pay and pay gaps are of course there, and employee engagement. So from the D&I perspective, what we've seen, and this has been a continuing trend over the years and not just in 24, is that employees are expecting employers to promote diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and in particular to support underrepresented groups. That's a growing trend and it's continuing there. And in terms of attracting talent and I suppose in terms of attracting talent and wanting to sort of stand by values, we're seeing that the companies that prioritise all of these aspects, in particular prioritising employee well-being through mental health support, through flexible working arrangements, and having comprehensive benefits associated with those are highly valued. And there is research that supports all of this. So Mercer did carry out some research, just some top-level pointers were that ESG is a key factor in engaging today's workforce. There was some research from Deloitte about the generational differences, which was quite interesting in terms of millennial and Gen Z employees being heavily influenced by their employers' ethical values in terms of choosing where they work. So all of this has very much then shaped what changes have come into play in 2024 in terms of employment law. There are some hot topics already floating around, such as the 4-day working week that many of us would have heard about, the trials that took place in 2024. Menopause in the workplace has continued to be a hot topic. There's also topics such as supporting employees suffering from domestic abuse, also making headlines in 2024. So the changes that we then saw very much relate to these themes that I've just touched on. So in 2024, April, we saw a big shake-up in terms of flexible working. That became a day one right, whereas previously staff would have had to have worked for 26 weeks to be able to make a flexible working request. Some new statutory rights were introduced. Carers leave, for instance, is a new right that came into play in April. There's been some enhancements to protections against redundancy for those on maternity leave and on parental leave. We've seen paternity leave become more flexible. The right itself hasn't changed very much, but it's become more flexible in terms of how it can be taken. There's also been increased scrutiny on fire and rehire practices. A new code of practice came into place. And most recently in October, there's a new duty now, a positive duty to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. And we're seeing new guidance coming through from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, for instance. There's now this positive legal duty. And these themes, I think, are very similar in the sense that they encompass and align closely with ESG principles that I've just spoken about and the expectations from employers. Now, looking forward to 2025 and beyond, the Employment Rights Bill was published again in October, so very recently. It's been described as the biggest shake-up of employment rights in decades. And the bill, again, very closely aligns with the ESG principles that I've just touched on. So I've put on the slide here some of the key highlights and the new changes that we're expecting to see. This is 2025 and beyond, I must say, because there's going to be a period of consultation in early 25 on many of these aspects and changes. So the mechanisms around them all are not quite set in stone just yet. For example, day one, unfair dismissal rights, which has been a very hot topic that many of you will have heard about, are unlikely to be enforced until autumn 2026, but there is a period of consultation in 2025, and we'll see how this works in practice. It is obviously a big shake-up, given that at the moment staff are required to have 2 years of service to benefit from unfair dismissal. So as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of topic and discussion on that front. And I've put on the slide there that there are a few other elements that we might see consulted on, such as the right to switch off. This didn't make its way into the Employment Rights Bill itself, but there is still a likely commitment to consult on the right to switch off and how this might look. It's unlikely to be legislative, but it may well be by way of a code of practice. So I think watch this space to see where that goes. And then finally, a quick reminder there that neonatal leave and pay also comes into force in April 2025. That was already consulted on and is something that's just being enforced in early 2025. So all of this, I think, in short, shows that the recent and upcoming changes are very much reflective of a broader commitment in creating a fairer, more transparent and more supportive work environment, which is at the heart of ESG principles. So it's safe to say that they've very much influenced what's happened and what's to come in employment law. So that's all from me, the end of the whistle-stop tour on the employment law front, and I'll now pass over to my colleague, Alex.
Thanks, Ramsey. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to spend about 5 minutes just doing a little bit of an overview of litigation risk for organisations in an ESG context and look at one specific type of risk which is on the rise. So next slide, please, Carla. Thank you. So the headline is that climate-related and ESG litigation is on the rise. And interestingly, there's research suggesting that any litigation brought against an organisation has a negative effect on share price and therefore corporate value if its shares are traded. And even more interestingly, the more novel the claim, so the more unusual and unexpected the type of claim, the greater the effect, which is interesting. It's almost as if the market can't price the effect of litigation. And then obviously you've got all of the additional inconvenience factor and having to spend money on defending a claim. So I wanted just also to call out, before we move on to the specific bits, 2 cases from the last year looking back. So many of you probably will have been aware of the decision of the Hague Court against Shell, which established that Shell had a general duty of care to the population at large, and therefore it should cut its emissions by 45% by 2030. Earlier this month, the court overturned that decision, but maintained the fact that Shell does have a general duty of care, but effectively said that 45% is arbitrary and there are various different pathways to net zero, and it's not for the court to say. And also, I thought I'd mention earlier this year, the litigation in the European Court of Human Rights against the Swiss government, brought by 3 different groups, and one of those groups succeeded, which was a group of 2,500 older Swiss citizens, the Verein Klima Senioren Schweiz. And effectively that it was found to be a breach of their human rights that the Swiss government did not have a carbon budget and its policies on emissions more generally. Okay, so moving on, please. So in the UK, broadly speaking, you've got 4 areas of legal risk that can lead to litigation in an ESG context. I think it's quite important to do a mapping exercise like this, because that's how you can start to put some numbers on the risk of a particular form of litigation, and then also the potential costs. So very briefly, you've got the sort of classic environmental claims where there's a breach of duty of care, a spill, harmful pollution, that sort of thing. breach of the director's duties, they look challenging under English law, but we may see more from activist organisations. Greenwashing related claims, and then securities litigation. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my talk. You'll hear a lot more on greenwashing from Katrina, but this diagram shows that actually in many cases greenwashing can be a trigger for litigation. So as I'll explain later, often a regulatory investigation will then give scope for claimants to come in afterwards and make financial claims for compensation. And there are various reasons why litigation is on the rise in the UK in an ESG context. A couple of particular things to highlight. Litigation funders have a lot of money in their pockets, somewhere between $1 and $3 billion, depending on which estimate you believe, that they'd like to invest in potentially profitable litigation. And the English court is increasingly becoming used to and a forum for collective action from a class of affected individuals, or in some cases companies. So moving on to the type of litigation we're going to focus on, which is securities litigation under Section 90 and 90A of FUSMA. You may be familiar with this. It only affects public companies, but a whole range of equity and debt securities that those companies issue. However, these messages are relevant to private companies too. So very broadly speaking, under Section 90, an investor can bring a claim if they suffer loss as a result of any untrue or misleading statement in or an omission from listing particulars or a prospectus. The liabilities for any person responsible, so that's both the company and potentially directors. There's no express requirement for reliance, unlike Section 90A, although in practice it's difficult to see how you would have a claim where there wasn't some kind of causation, even if it's not reliance. And then there are defences. So if the company had a reasonable belief in what it stated, or the omission was proper, and there's guidance in the legislation around what proper means. And then Section 90 is similar, but it takes us into a broader range of published information. So it's any information published by a regulatory information service. And then also a person discharging management responsibilities in practice, a director has to have the required knowledge as to the untruth or misleading nature of the statement, or recklessness as to that or the omission. And then there's also reliance basically has to be reasonable. So there has to be reliance by the investor on the information to make a decision as to whether to buy, sell, hold securities. And the standard is broadly similar to the common law standard for inducement or deceit. So moving on. There's an industry developing in relation to Section 90 and 98 claims. The floodgates are opened by the successful claim that HP brought against Autonomy in relation to its purchase of Autonomy many years ago. And now we've got 3 pending ESG related Section 90 claims, all brought by the same law firm. And they all have a very similar profile. So against Petrofac, it relates to bribery in the Middle East, which wasn't disclosed at the time. An SFO investigation then led to criminal charges against the director and the company. And that claim has actually been issued, and there is a claim form. But even though it was issued over a year ago, we don't yet have pleadings in the case. They should be coming later this month. Which is unusual. So there have been various orders from the court extending the time for service, presumably because the class of individuals affected has been growing. And there's a case of the court waiting until that is completed. And then in the earlier stages, we've had a claim brought against Boohoo in connection with the labour rights violations, which were widely publicised, including in the Times in 2020 and 2022. And Entain, again, in relation to bribery offences in Turkey and a deferred prosecution agreement that Entain signed last year. So moving on. What are the implications here? Well, obviously, you appreciate that most of all of those claims that have been brought so far relate to social factors, bribery, human rights violations, and so on. But I think it's reasonable to expect that that net will broaden into climate-related Section 90 claims as well, particularly because of the increasing reporting burden and general enhanced market standards that Jude mentioned. And it's important to know that there are law firms out there and litigation funders that are actively looking for triggers, regulatory investigations, corrections, and so on, that might lead to the possibility of bringing a claim for untrue or misleading statements or omissions. So there's a balance between transparency, say about your companies or organizations' net zero objectives, and not giving ammunition to those who then could bring a claim. For example, if your net zero target is in an annual report and then it transpires that it's actually impossible to meet, how do you update the market and when without risking litigation is an interesting question. There's a knock-on impact on private company claims because all this litigation under Section 90 will further clarify, the 90A rather, will further clarify reliance and deceit. And so therefore, in the context of private share transactions, you can expect that that will give us further certainty as to when investors can and can't bring claims in relation to untrue or misleading statements in connection with those purchases. And then what to do? Well, I think it's a good idea to review governance and compliance across the whole supply chain, no easy task, and ESG reporting strategy more generally, thinking about consistency between different reports and countries, but obviously reporting standard harmonization will help with that over time. If you don't already have a legal and litigation risk matrix, I would recommend doing that exercise. It's well worthwhile. It helps to clarify things and start to think about where the risk is likely to arise and what mitigations you can put in place. Assurance is really important in relation to all published information, and ideally get assurance from a range of people, not just accountants, but maybe lawyers too. And also looking at insurance is really important with novel types of claim, lead to novel types of liability, both for directors and for the company. And it's important to look at that quite hard. Insurers are developing new product lines, but obviously the devil is in the detail, particularly with insurance contracts. So with that, I will hand over to Katrina, who's going to talk about greenwashing.
Thanks, Alex. And yes, I'm going to talk about greenwashing, which is a particular sort of, I suppose, risk in relation to claims. Mainly, what we're talking about here, rather than litigation, as Alex has been talking about, is actually about regulatory enforcement. And before I focus on what's happened this year, I just wanted to take us all back a little bit. Carla, could you move on to the next slide? Thank you. Just a little bit of history on greenwashing. So greenwashing is a term that's been bandied around for a while, but I think it's fair to say that advertising lawyers like myself pre-2020, well, 2020 and backwards, would have said that a green or sustainability claim is, should be treated like any other claim. It requires substantiation. It must not be misleading. But starting sort of the back end of 2021, the position changed. So the CMA published its Green Claims Code, which was an unusual step because normally with the Competition and Markets Authority, guidance follows an investigation. In this case, they published the guidance and then said everyone had until Christmas to get their house in order. And then they kicked off their first investigation, actually not immediately after Christmas, but a little bit later than that, middle of 2022. And we've now had the fast fashion investigation, which resulted in enforcement against 3 companies and some very onerous undertakings. They then launched a subsequent one into consumer goods, which has just closed. And we're waiting to see if there's going to be a third investigation. The CMA has suggested that that's likely, and we know that they're very influenced by the UK Climate Change Committee's guidance. So, industries and sectors that are of particular concern in that guidance are ones to watch, for example, travel and also food and beverage. But the other side of the greenwashing enforcement, on my next slide, Carla, is about ASA enforcement, because in parallel, the CMA and the ASA are working together. And the thing about the ASA enforcement is it's a lot quicker, so we get decisions a lot faster. But I thought it was also worth sharing this slide just to illustrate that the ASA working with the CMA made a massive impact on the volume of enforcement that we saw around green claims. prior to the guidance coming out in 2021, there was always some enforcement around green claims, but importantly, it was fairly low level, and also sometimes people won. So that grey box there is the number of not upheld rulings. Starting 2022, we suddenly shifted to sort of double to treble the amount, and people actually getting a not upheld ruling was really, really rare. Almost all decisions were upheld, or as in pink, partially upheld. So the enforcement climate is very different now. We don't expect this to stop. So we are operating in a very serious enforcement climate. Carl, oh, thank you. The other things I wanted to touch on in terms of what's happened in 2024 is as a result of all these decisions. Well, first of all, we've got the decisions themselves, which tell us lots of interesting things about how the ASA and the CMA are thinking about these issues. But also, we've got a lot of new guidance coming out, particularly from CAP, so that's the advertising guidance. And they tend to focus on quite discrete issues. So we've had things like transport and green disposal, and the latest one, which came out last week, on regenerative farming. But the other big news that we had at the beginning of this year is we got to see the undertakings that the CMA asked the companies as part of the fast fashion investigation to enter into. And off the back of that, they issued some guidance specifically for fashion. Now, even if you are not in the fashion industry, this guidance is really interesting, as are the undertakings, because for the first time, the guidance didn't just talk about the things that we know we need in advertising, like substantiation, but talked about the internal processes that the CMA expects to see. It talked about the contracts that the CMA expects to see to underpin the collection of substantiation. So it gave a really good steer on what that kind of internal processes and systems, what the CMA is expecting to see if it lifts the lid on your business to see whether it is, has issues around greenwashing. So it's a really interesting steer from that point of view. But the other thing, of course, we got is lots and lots of rulings. Honestly, we could do an entire seminar on what we learned from ASA decisions in terms of rulings in 2024. But I just wanted to highlight a couple that I thought were really significant. So the first one was the Wessex Water ruling. And this is all about what is misleading in the context of when you have a sort of wider problem in this area. So this was a TV ad all about the efforts that were being made to make sure that sewage didn't get into water, the changes that were being made to the water systems to facilitate this. There was absolutely no dispute that all of this was true and was happening. The dispute was about the fact of whether or not it should have been disclosed that this was being done pursuant to the fact that the Environment Agency had rated Wessex Water very low as a result of issues with sewage, and whether that context about the issues that Wessex Water had previously had in terms of sewage and the low rating from the Environment Agency was material information that should have been disclosed in the Act. And the ASA said, yes, it was. So there is increasingly an expectation that anything you say about the good works that you are doing in terms of environmental claims must be contextualized and put in the wider picture of what else is going on in your business and any issues that you might have had. So there's a need to be transparent about that, which is a very challenging thing for marketing teams to work with for obvious reasons. And then the other one I wanted to mention was the Virgin Atlantic ruling, which was all about something called sustainable aviation fuel. And a couple of key points to take out about sustainable aviation fuel. Firstly, the ASA said, just because this is a term that is understood in your industry and is widely used in environmental reporting does not mean that it is not misleading to consumers. So taking terms that ESG professionals are familiar with the industry's professional, like maybe scope 3 emissions, does not necessarily translate well when you start to talk to consumers. So you need to be really careful about those terms. But they were also concerned about the fact that it included the word sustainable. And it was not qualified in any point that this didn't mean zero emissions. It didn't mean that your flight across the Atlantic would have no environmental impact. And even though robust data was shown that up to about 70% of consumers were not misled about this, the ASA still said a meaningful amount of consumers were misled, and therefore the use of this term was misleading without that qualification. So it's showing the bar is incredibly high on what is misleading in the context of environmental claims, and your data will be scrutinised. And then finally, before I move on to predictions, I just wanted to share this slide, which I won't go through in detail, but it is a little bit of a summary about what the CMA undertakings from fast fashion and the fashion guidance told us about what is expected in terms of compliance. Now, obviously, this is in the context of fashion retailers, so it may require some translation for different types of businesses, but I think it is really interesting to see that they're expecting to see regular training of staff who are drafting claims. They're expecting to see spot checks. They're expecting to see contractual obligations to provide the data, to do a sustainability questionnaire, to keep that data up to date and to be auditing it. All of that is about internal processes, about how businesses manage this. And increasingly, there is an expectation that if you are doing a lot of green claims, that kind of management will be in place. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on some predictions for 2025. So the first thing is to say that the ASA is using AI to scrape environmental claims, in particular sectors like food and beverage, which means that they are proactively enforcing this area. So we can definitely expect to see more ASA decisions, particularly around food and beverage green claims. I think a third CMA greenwashing investigation is still on the card. It could this time be backed by the new power of the CMA of 10% global turnover fines under DMCC, which will come into effect, we think, from April. So probably the investigation will be announced after those fines come into effect. Possibly we will see some successful greenwashing cases against companies coming through the courts, which would move the dial on risk as well. And I think we'll also see a focus on greenwashing outside of advertising and increasingly on things like sustainability reports. And I think the regulators are increasingly getting interested in the S in ESG, so what you might loosely call social washing or diversity washing, or making claims in that area, and we'll start to think about what substantiation we need there.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and thank you very much to Remzi, Alex and Jude as well for their fascinating presentations. I hope that has been very useful to all of you joined today, and if there are any things that have come up from what any of our panelists have said today that interests you or you'd like to hear more about, please drop it in the poll or in the feedback, which we'll issue at the end of the session. So we have had a couple of questions in the chat box, so I'm going to open them up. They may be applicable to all of you or may be applicable to some of you. So if you want to take the question, please just go ahead and take it, and I'll obviously try and field. So the first question is, and this is one probably for you, Remzi, should you have a separate sexual harassment policy, or can you cover this off in a safeguarding policy or an EDI policy?
Thank you, Carla. That's a really good question, and often there is some overlap with those policies that have been named. But given that the threshold is higher now and the bar has very much been raised, particularly with this new change and a positive duty on employers to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment, and also taking on board the new guidance from the EHRC that I mentioned, I would always recommend a standalone policy. I think this will demonstrate a commitment to preventing harassment in the workplace and coupled with that, awareness of that policy is going to be quite important, as is having training on that policy, both from the top to the bottom. So making sure that there's training available to leaders in a business and organisation, and then trickling that and cascading it down to the workforce. I think that's probably going to be something that is expected of employers, particularly now we've had these new changes come into place.
Thanks, Ramsey. And I think the point on training is really critical as well, because it's something that's being expected more and more across the ESG agenda. And it's something certainly companies should consider across all aspects of ESG. And if there's anything obviously that interests you or that we could help you with, please do get in contact with one or all of us. The second question that we've had that will sit, which is probably one for Alex, but also may also be an interesting one for Katrina and Jude to consider. Really intrigued by the comment that impossible CO2 emission targets could trigger litigation. Given the challenging nature of CO2 emission targets and often well-intentioned ambitions of businesses, do you have any guidance on how an overambitious target might result in a cause of action and how to mitigate the risk? So Alex, if you're happy to take that first, and then Katrina and Jude, if you have anything to add on to thoughts about ambitious CO2 emission targets.
Yeah, I can have the first go. There's a real tension, isn't there? Because if I'm advising a business, in terms of how to make progress towards emissions reduction, the first thing to do is set a target. In terms of making the target realistic, obviously, there are consultants that can help. The science as the SBTI targets, although they're robust in the sense of leading to the right pathway, the process of going through that does lead to a greater degree of realism, which might help. More broadly, I think you have to accept that you have to frame targets in the right way, which is, this is our ambition, this is what we hope to achieve, and then update the market on progress regularly and be quite forthright if things aren't going according to plan and what you're going to do to try and put things back on track. I think that level of transparency, the combination of a target with transparency, would be probably the best way of mitigating risk, because ultimately then you're not misleading the market, or at least not misleading the market for an extended period of time, which will help.
Thanks, Alex.
From a regulatory enforcement point of view, the CMA has been quite clear about what they expect from emission plans. They expect you to have a plan about how you're going to get there. They expect it to have KPIs, and they expect it to be monitored. And they expect you to have a feedback loop, so that if at any point, as Alex mentioned, you're missing your target, you should be amending your claims about your target, or you should be putting in place new measures to make sure you still reach it. So all of which I think would probably help. Alex, do chip in on the kind of litigation risk as well, because you would have that material not just to show to a regulator in events of regulatory enforcement, but also could be helpful in a defence in any litigation.
Thanks, Katrina. And Jude, do you have anything to add from a reporting or governance perspective on that point?
Yeah, so it is a question, we get quite often. I think things that from a reporting perspective, certainly you can do is to definitely engage with stakeholders to understand what their expectations are, but also understand that they appreciate and they understand the targets that you are setting and that you're working to. Because it's important. Ultimately, that's what reporting is about. It's communicating to your stakeholders. So ensuring they understand what we're communicating is really important. And scenario planning, it will also help with identifying potential risks and challenges that you might encounter when you're trying to achieve some of these potentially challenging targets. And I suppose finally, and this is not a plug for legal services, but you can, and many clients do, get their communications, their reports reviewed by legal teams like ourselves.
And I think that's a really good point. It's about transparency, it's about communicating clearly, it's about making sure your information is robust, it's backed up. It comes back to that training point again we've been talking about, and just getting other professionals involved, so you know that when you put out claims, you know that they're robust, they're sound, so it doesn't lead to litigation like Alex was talking about earlier. And just before we close session, we've had one last question, which is more of an admin point for me. Is there a recording from the session? And if there is, will it be available somewhere else? So yes, we have recorded this session and it will be available on the Mills and Reeve website later in this week. If you'd like to give us some feedback, we'd absolutely love to hear some. How did we do today? Apologies for the technical glitches, so please avoid that in your feedback, but feedback on the speakers today and whether they covered topics you're interested in or whether there's something else you'd like to hear about would be fantastic. Please complete the survey once the webinar has finished. And we do have another webinar coming up soon on the 11th of December at 10 o'clock, and it's going to be a roundup of 2024. So the session will provide a roundup of some of the significant legal developments from 2024. We'll also touch on some of the developments we're expecting in 2025. This hour-long webinar will focus on developments in commercial contracts, employment law, and dispute resolution. Rachel McDonald will also give an update on the new failure to prevent fraud offence, which will come into force in September 2025. So that sounds like it'll be a really interesting and informative session. So do sign up on the Mills and Reeve website if you haven't already done so. And last thing to say for me is thank you very much to you for joining us. Thank you to all our speakers today. And please do get in touch if there's anything you'd like to ask us following the session or any feedback you'd like to give us on today or any ESG topics you'd like to hear more from in future. And have a fantastic day.